curious individuals interested in all sorts of recondite, obscure, and esoteric subjects. By popular demand, I have asked Mr. Rudisil if he is willing to discuss esoteric subjects with us, and he said yes.
I do appreciate your headgear, by the way. I think it's absolutely marvelous.
Inherited from a family.
Inherited?
Yeah.
Ah, yes. Well, I see that you don't have the turban wound around the base of it.
No. My ego is not ready yet to be laid to rest. Therefore, it's not fitting that any tombstone be raised over it.
There you are, you see. There you are. The esoterica of Shrinerism, eh? I do love them. But now let's take it very easily and gently here with this esoterica stuff. And let's talk about signs, symbols, images, etc. Whatever your ego, persona, complex, and lesser self may have a use for to explain to itself the truths the greater self has to tell. So, shall we take a bit of tarot? Shall we take a bit of dream symbolism? Shall we take a bit of mythology? What shall we take to start with, do you think?
Well, I think it may be useful for people to gain some sort of general understanding of what you mean when you say the ego persona complex, the small self, and the greater self, as you put it, with the capital S. What precisely do you mean when you use these terms?
Well, these are levels of consciousness. Most people only have the ego persona complex. Now, what you normally have there is a limited edition of, shall we say, a complete circle, sphere actually, of ego and persona complexes. Thus you have, let's say somebody who considers himself a He-Man. He has all the He-Man complex, and nice little slice of the ego, nice little plug out of the sphere of ego persona complexes. His ego and his persona complexes will deal with the He-Man and that which is not He-Man.
You mean in this?
Predominantly.
You mean in the sense that every bully requires a coward, every coward requires a bully?
Damn, you grasped that quickly, old son.
And when you refer to these ideas, I'm sorry, I should say when you mention things like this persona complex, the way I came to an understanding of it, which might be useful in terms of framing it all up, is a sense of a deck of cards. So you have any number of persona, which you mean by that, of course, you're going back to the etymological roots, masks. And so I kind of think of a deck of cards that's also like a deck of masks, in the sense that you can, to mix these metaphors, in the sense that you can shuffle through them consciously or unconsciously, with intent or without, and raise one of them up that's useful for a particular circumstance. So I guess the root there is that a given persona is a thing that comes into being as a way to interact within a given framework or context. So one way to explain the personas would be that you behave in a different fashion. You wear a different mask when you go to ask for a loan at the bank than the mask that you might wear were you to sidle up to a woman at a bar and attempt to hit on her. Than you would, for example, if you were a DI who was trying to whip a bunch of raw recruits into shape. In each one of these instances, a given presentation, a given association of attitudes, perspectives, and behaviors would be brought online, ultimately because of their relative value or chance of success within an evolutionary or survival context.
Yes, quite.
And so, the ego is the more or less, and there's a wide range there, awareness that sort of sits behind this shuffling of the cards, of bringing these personas to the fore. So could we say, for purposes of discussion of this particular level, the ego persona complex, that the ego is at this level little more than a sort of a sum of the persona available to it?
The sum of the persona that have been available to it in this life and in others. The ego evolves, you see. Yes, you may have noticed from earliest life that there were certain things you would not do and certain things that you simply had to do. Yes, quite so. Well, these were dependent upon your ego and its current state of, shall we say, evolution
or
toward consciousness.
Or development, anyway.
Let us hope that it is evolution. But we'll go with development. The point being that the ego changes. It changes. And as it changes, it throws away and brings in other persona complexes. Complexes because they constitute this lovely section, this plug, if you will, of ego persona consciousness. In order to be conscious in the personas, one must come to an understanding of them. One must enable them and come to live in them to a certain degree.
With consciousness.
Well, yes, with consciousness.
Because that's an interesting...
Now,
if I may, I'd like to insert two illustrative little asides as regards these personas. As I recall, and as I myself have now seen and considered, they come into being based, as I mentioned before, on this idea of their survival value in a given circumstance. You know, as we were just discussing, you put on a given mask when you go to ask for a loan at the bank because, at least in theory, it will yield a higher chance of success for you. And so there's kind of two things I want to point out here. One is about their potential for an increased survival value, you know, this sort of evolutionary selection side of it. And the other is about the consciousness and the conscious and unconscious operation of the persona. So the first one is that, and you had discussed this with me years before, that children imitate based on the potential for success so far as they can see it. So when you see little children playing on the playground, and in many respects that amounts to little more than trying on different persona and seeing how they work in the social milieu that the child is operating in, you're not going to see them saying, well, I'm going to go ahead and try on the mask of a junkie bum. You have instead children, you know, they say, what do you want to be when you grow up, Sally? Well, I'm going to be the female president. You know, what do you want to be, Johnny? I'm going to be an astronaut. I'm going to be a fireman. So they're drawn to a given understanding of themselves, which manifests as a context-dependent persona based on the likelihood that that's going to give them something, that it's going to be successful.
Context-dependent. Do adults do anything more, do you think?
No.
Oh.
And here we jump over to consciousness and unconsciousness, because I want to add two little anecdotes that illustrate that side of it.
Please do.
You have, for those of the viewing audience who've ever dealt with psychedelics or similar things, there is a point that people will come to if, for example, you drop acid, where there will be I used to call it the frenzy, where the mind begins to get overloaded rather quickly by the effects of this drug, and for a time, it's an onset of the trip. There is a point at which it is very difficult, or was for me, and for most people that I witnessed, it's very difficult for them to maintain a continuous thread of self-awareness through that initial jumble. It's where there's a sudden chemically dependent cracking of the self-awareness. And at that point, I've always been interested in seeing the way in which people become a thing that just reacts to their environment. I remember watching groups of kids tripping, and I was one of them, and I was a kid at the time, so that you don't think it was some really perverse shit going on. I was in this...
oh, that's a shame. I was looking forward to it.
Yes, I wasn't 40 years old doing a bunch of LSD with 16-year-olds. I was, in fact, a part of that whole program. And I watched as people would be gone. They'd be drifting off in whatever reverie they were lost in, if there was any them at that moment to experience said reverie. And I noticed that only by kind of stinging them with... by talking to them in a certain way that would call out a response, I would see this persona sort of come to life in front of me. But it would remain only so long as I gave them the irritation that brought that thing out. If I laid off saying, like to give an example, because otherwise it's too abstract. If you got, a group of males who are in their teens and you're sitting around all fucked up and they're drifting off in la la land under the influence of a psychedelic and they don't seem to be present, but you say some typical mocking teenage shit like, man, you're a fucking pussy, right? You'd get a response, oh, I'm not, right? This kind of thing would come to life in answer to the environmental circumstance. So that's one of the ways that I wanted to point out how it's unconscious, and it comes to being in response to some given stimuli that would seem to demand a context-dependent response. Hence, the mask comes into being or is deployed. And the second thing I wanted to point out is the business, like when, you had recommended I take a look at John Weir Perry's books, in particular, The Far Side of Madness, about schizophrenia. And the way in which what appears to happen there is that some fundamental understanding of the ego is fractured. Some information comes online, or some experience is had by the individual, which in its scope, by its nature, forces that individual to call into question the most deeply seated understandings he or she might have. At which point...
of that particular ego persona complex.
Right. At which point, that persona complex has to be kind of... I think of it in the way that you think about a bone that has to be rebroken and because it's healed wrong. But that's not perhaps the best metaphor. But it's similar to the way in which the ego is kind of shattered temporarily by the ingestion of the chemicals with LSD. There's a parallel there. But in the case of the individual who becomes schizophrenic as a result, something has hit them that has fragmented their ego understanding such that it no longer provides a unifying field around the different masks that are deployed, at which point you can see the consciousness moving from one mask to another, trying to find one that fits. And because there's no centralizing ego understanding, while that point of consciousness is behind a given sticky mask, it mistakes that state for the sum total of what it is. And hence you get the phenomena of schizophrenia, in the sense at least of, in the conventional dramatic sense it's usually understood, of moving between different personalities without the sense that there is a unifying whole.
But there is a unifying whole. It just is not available to the conscious mind.
Well, that sounds as though the ego almost acts like a transmission between the small self and greater self and the persona.
Really? You don't mean that?
And I'll add...
like a transmitting device. I'm terribly sorry to go ahead.
And I'll add one last one.
Yes, go ahead.
Which is when I've seen... it's happened particularly with women, when there's been a heavy emotional thing, like if I was in this serious relationship as I was in the past with a female and everything's fucked up and there's high emotional tension because everybody has investment in their respective positions and it's come to a head and there's a fight or an argument or whatever. Mm-hmm. I've watched that if I push with a given point and I keep staying on that point about there being whatever the issue is in the example, right? You don't do this, or you do this, or whatever, doesn't matter. That you can push against these layers with, in this example, we'll say the female that I'm talking to, And they'll try various things. They'll try the first mask. They pull it out of the deck. This seems to fit in this contingency, right? And yet you keep pushing, and they have to take that one, stick it back in the deck, and pull another one. And if you keep driving at the point, and those persona aren't up to the task of dealing with whatever they've been pulled out of the deck for, I often find that at the very end, the last one that I get is a little girl with her head tipped down, looking up from under her eyebrows, trying to be a little bit cute, to see if she can maybe make daddy not be angry. And I don't suggest that this only happens with females. Males, of course, have their exact analogs for this. But it shows the way in which the persona are deployed to meet the circumstances, and when they don't, they'll fall back on ones that are more and more deeply set.
Yes, they will. Until eventually you reach the point where they fall back on one that is non-gender specific, which is the ego itself. You have to remember that most people don't peel the ego back to the point that they reach the non-gender specific version of it. They peel it back to where they reach the most rudimentary of gender-specific egos, which is your little girl and little boy.
Right. Pink and blue, ribbons and balloons.
Whatever. The point being that all of these are basically nothing more than masks. Nothing more than ways it can be. You see? It could be this way. You could be like that. Let's be honest about it. Nothing of the human condition may be foreign to you. Nothing. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what your ego demands. Nothing of the human condition can be foreign to you. Nothing.
Meaning in potential we have liars, thieves, gamblers, whores, statesmen, heroes, moms, dads. All five.
All of the above and some more shit too, yes.
World without end. I mean.
There it is. The point being that all of these come to you in various and sundry disguises. Now, if you want to be these ego persona complexes, then needless to say, along with the ego persona, you get ways of dressing and being. Yes.
Types of cars you have to have, neighborhoods you have to live in, brands that you favor, music that you talk about with your friends. They come with complete sets.
Forms of esoterica that you like the Shriner's hat you're wearing currently.
Or the right-hand path, or the left-hand path.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Guerre Rouge and Boudon. But be all that as it may, what we have is ways in which it can be. Now that's important. It can be any way at all, in potentia. You see. Now this is where you get into the lesser self and the greater self. The lesser self is a thing that has many egos, many stages of the ego at its command. Just as the ego has many types of persona at its command. So you take the lesser self and you have many, many ego types. Many ego types. Black women. You could be a black woman. Honey. You could be a Hispanic woman. You could be a Guatemalan Mayan type woman. You could be an African of some sort. You could be these things if they fitted with what, oh my goodness, what you needed at a specific time and location in this arc of development that is the birth, training, and death of the ego. Now, all of these fit together very nicely with the overriding image of the greater self, which exists just a hair below where there is time. Not duration, but time. Time is. It neither passes, comes into existence, goes out of existence. Time is.
So would you say that what you're calling time maps more or less to the concept of eternity?
Well, now, eternity is a part of time. Only a part of it, because it presupposes the passage of things.
Does it? I mean, with the
Yeah.
more intellectually interesting medieval philosophers, they posited aeternitas in parte ante, aeternitas in parte post, which meant that the before and after of any of these things were entirely relative depending on where you wanted to place your dividing line within that eternity. There was no passage of it, so to speak.
In which case there must still be something which appreciates the passage of time.
I see. So it's more like a subject-object, observer-observed kind of issue.
My goodness, you don't mean. Nicholas of Cusa was a bit more involved, and yet quite a bit simpler than most people ever think him to be. Cusa, C-U-S-A, as I recall, Nicholas of Cusa, lovely man, medieval philosopher, dealt with potentia, that which is in potential there, and that which is there, posse and posse est. Lovely man, I commend him to your attention. By this I address the viewers. I commend him most heartily to your attention. He did not have the maths for it, the mathematics for it, but he did have a fine grasp of posse est and posse. It's an interesting thing. So you've got the greater self just a hair below where everything is suddenly in potentia there, even that which cannot be. You must first postulate that it can be.
That's the point.
Before you can postulate that it cannot be. Do go ahead, Ollie. I'm terribly sorry.
Not at all. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to ask, is that something that we can sort of see as that point at which, for example, divine names coincide? Or to not take the Muslim angle, right? For those who don't know anything about the Muslim approach on it, they go through these 99 names, each of which is a way of summarizing a quality of God. And then they, in theory at least...
That every wise man must himself go through.
Yes, because they are phases or modes, or like moving up through notes in a scale. And yet it goes back to... Neoplatonic roots, and then frankly to more purely Platonic roots, where the idea is that all of the idea is, indeed, that these ideals at a certain point converge. So the bonum, the good, is coextensive at that level with the wise, or with the true.
There is no bonum. That is still down here with the parsing of eternity.
But other than the technique of negative theology, the only way you can really dig into that is by the attempt to superimpose these seemingly contradictory, or in some cases harmonious things, to see a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts.
Do you remember, I hope you do, trust you do, the nature of the infinitely small and the infinitely large?
Returning to Cusa, yes.
Do you recall that the one thing they have in common is they are infinite, both of them, and therefore the same?
Yes.
This would do away with your bonum, would it not?
Well, in any
What's
real
good about
sense.
a fractal? What's good about a fractal?
Or isomorphism, sure. Well, but you're kind of jumping into the idea of splitting ontology from ethics, and that's fine, because this is a realm without ethics, so to speak.
Indeed it is. It's a realm without ethics, and a realm with the hardest, most cast iron of ethics.
That would be karma.
At the same time. Karma is the way in which ethics is worked out, yes, but only the way in which ethics is worked out in its own framework. Karma for one individual may not be karma for another, because the one individual may or may not have the understanding necessary to appreciate the karma they have incurred. And appreciation of karma is the note of greatness in this very realm that we occupy. And you'll notice I say occupy. Yes. Karma is to all things different and totally based upon your understanding, because it does no good to try to teach trigonometry to someone who has no numeracy at all. You must first teach numbers, then you must teach addition and subtraction, and then multiplication and division, and then algebra, calculus, etc.
Right, and to someone
Geometry.
who hasn't learned to count, calculus simply can't be seen. It can't even be recognized as being present.
Exactly so. The real thing here is that just below this level, where there is only time, there is only potentia, just below that level is where the great self resides. Your holy names and so on, the 99 names of God.
Or Platonic ideals.
I was going to say Platonic ideals, etc., etc. All of these things mesh there and are basically the toys of that place.
Meaning they fall short of the mark of anything that could be considered absolute.
Oh, definitely. Way short of anything that could be considered absolute. Absolute is an absolute absurdity.
And so the only path beyond that that I'm aware of, other than the classic Gnostic concept of tasting, right? Rather than think about or talk about, simply be. But short of that, if such a leap eludes many, myself included, the only path available for consideration of such places beyond that point would be negative theology.
Negative theology, like positive theology, suffers a problem. It postulates a theology, a theos, a God, something which is eternal, something which is beyond your ability to conceive of, something which is basically horse shit. There is nothing in this universe which you cannot conceive. Nothing. There is nothing in any of the multiverse you cannot conceive. And in some part of the multiverse, your conception will be the reality. Because the multiverse is, infinite. Always and forever. No matter how you try, no matter how you parse, no matter how you include and exclude, you find yourself limited by your ability to conceive. I wasn't joking when I asked earlier about fractals. My intent was to lead you into the realm of chaos physics, if you will. The first thing about such an area is that Newtonian physics doesn't work there. Newtonian physics does not apply there.
Shit, I mean, just
It
looking
applies here.
to some
I'm
extent,
sorry.
but I was just going to say, in trying to accommodate, electromagnetism, Newtonian physics, the theory of gravity, all the rest, trying to come up with a grand unified theory. We're already having trouble down at this level, just accounting for things that can be measured empirically by physics.
But yes, we are. On top of which, what makes you think that we won't reach a realm shortly where the very ideas that we consider now to be beyond the realm of Newtonian physics don't apply, in the same way that Newtonian physics doesn't apply to that realm? That the physics of that realm will not apply beyond that realm. Interesting, is it not?
Interest.
When you consider that you exist in all of these realms. You, your greater self, even your lesser self to a certain degree, exist in this multiverse, in this whirling miasma, countervailing forces dependent upon how you take them and at what level you take them.
There is nothing but thinking makes it so. What's that line from Hamlet?
That's it.
I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself the king of infinite space.
You could. That has been any number of the plot lines, starting with Star Wars is a good one. Not Star Wars, what was it? That damn silly ass nonsense with the Voyager proudly go where no man has gone.
Star Trek, yeah.
That's it, Star Trek. I knew it was in there somewhere. Where they came upon the individual guarding a universe, and the universe was in a little nutshell, as it were. And yet, when you entered it, it was a universe. The multiverse is much the same way, only it parses itself out at each level. Each level constitutes a universe split into an infinite group of universes that duplicate each other except for one thing, and one thing only. A dozen things only.
Yeah, that's the problem with infinity. Once you begin to fiddle about with it conceptually, there are no limits. How's that for a trait statement?
Golly gee, you mean there's no limits to infinity?
Yes,
well, all right. Yeah, that means that the awareness of infinity must come in a flash of consciousness that forever changes how you will see the universe, that forever changes how you see everything, even that which cannot be seen. You wonder where I get my laugh. I get my laugh from experience of consciousness. There is no such thing as mental illness. Nothing at all like mental illness. I am familiar with all the theories about, well, they just dressed themselves up as doctors and went in there and came up with all these names. Yeah, it's all bullshit. All of that is nonsense. What you have is the the way in which the ego accepts the personas, and the way in which the personas accept the ego, and the way in which the lesser self accepts all of them. And that's basically it.
And yet we have this whole industry, this rather vile industry that is premised on the idea that this is in fact illness, when, to your point about perspective and understanding of circumstance and how it can shape one's experience, in reality it could be argued on a quite solid basis that all that we call mental illness is in fact the process of trying to get well.
That presupposes that there is some sickness, some disease, some illness, some structure other than normal. Oops, normal?
Yeah.
Why, normal is not really applicable in this instance, is it?
What could be more subjective? And yet they seem to be willing to allow this entirely unquantifiable, empirically thing, this normalcy. I guess it is quantifiable in the sense that it can be established through statistics, but it has no existence. None.
Have you ever noticed that all people who go to a Freudian psychotherapist develop Freudian systems of dysfunction and function?
Jung,
all who
Reich,
go to
Adler.
Jungians, yes. Odd, isn't it? You wouldn't think they could do that, would you? Except this ego sits back there and goes, well, let me bring out the personas that are going to work on this. And to be honest with you, continue the system.
Not to mention things like projection and transference. Yes.
Goodness gracious, projection and transference. I love projection and transference. The point is that transference is not as limited as the average psychiatrist makes them. Transference is a two-way street.
And it makes the world go round.
Actually, that's money. But be that as it may. The point is that there is no normalcy. When you peel someone down and get past the socially acceptable ways of doing things, every last one of us is a fucking fruitcake. Crazy as a bedbug as far as everybody else is concerned. We simply know to go, oh yes, when the normal things come by. I agree with that.
And we return now to persona.
Indeed we do we not?
And we are also coming up on the edges of the space in this clip. So not to shut all this down, as I've learned over many years, there's this will flow forth without end from you. Given that you have no shortage.
Are you saying I have psychic diarrhea?
Far be it from me to say such a thing. But perhaps you could wind it back down around to some sort of closing statement about the ego personas, the small self and the greater self, that will serve as a kind of wrap, and then viewers who have wanted to hear your thoughts on esoterica can now take their experience of this clip off and give some more thought to whether they want to hear any more of it.
Screaming into the bushes, eh? Well, all right, we'll let them run screaming into the bushes. I will tell you the ultimate secret of reality, and may it do you lots of good. It's all one, Ollie. It's all one.